Welcome to the Knowledge Entrepreneurs Show, where we celebrate the innovators driving change in the education industry. At Edison OS, we've worked with over 500 knowledge entrepreneurs to turn their EdTech ideas into profitable businesses. Hi, William. Welcome to the Knowledge Entrepreneur Show. Thanks so much for taking time out for this.
Yes, thanks for inviting me. Yeah.
My pleasure, William. William, my first question has got to do with the test prep, SAT and ACT going digital. So when it first did, what was your general reaction like?
First, I was not that thrilled with it just because I had originally started in the SAT world right around the time of the previous change. So as
Right.
they were going from the 2400 to the 1600 test, and I had just gotten used to all the materials basically, and where all the questions were, and all of the different strategies and things like that. But I did at least figure that, well, I had been doing it for long enough that I could try to get a head start on the new test and see what translated. And then as I looked into it more, I realized that some of the question types still carried over, and then others were familiar from GRE and GMAT, more like the logically completing the text question and the strength and weaken questions. So I felt like I had a little bit of a head start in those from doing tutoring on those tests, although maybe those questions aren't quite as close. When it really gets down to it, they have their own tendencies on the SAT compared to those other tests. But another thing that is kind of difficult with the newer test is that they used to have the QAS, the question and answer service, so students could at least sometimes get their actual test questions, and that would give us something in terms of tutoring to go over, and it would also give a way to kind of keep up with what was on the test to some extent. I guess there's still a little bit of a way to do that with as they release new Blue Book tests, but it's harder to keep tabs on how the current test relates to the prep materials that are available. And then the ACT, it's really the SAT. I was probably about 50-50 or maybe 60-40 in terms of those two tests, doing about 50-50 or maybe a little more SAT. But since then, it's been more like 95-5 or 99-1 with the SAT. And so I don't know if that necessarily reflects the whole market or not. But I think for a lot of students, at least prior to the actual switch over to the ACT going digital and to a shorter test, I think it's tough for a lot of students to want to sit down and do a 3 to 4 hour test as opposed to a 2 hour test.
Yeah.
So,
Got it, William.
yeah.
And ACT is yet to launch its enhanced ACT. I think it's happening sometime next month.
Right.
And which is also next week, sort of.
Yeah.
And the 2400 to 1600 was 2016.
Yes, it was late 2015, or I think it was. I mean,
Right.
it was right at the very end. There was sort of, I guess, an emergency opening at a local tutoring center that asked if I could help them, and I said, well, they didn't even know about the test format changing, and I had to get up to speed on it and realize that, well, there's not a whole lot we can do for this last test. This 1 month. Where I think there was one more administration of the 2400 test being given, and then it switched over. Yeah.
Got it, William.
Yeah.
And William, how was your transition when SAT went, into digital SAT as a test prep tutor? What did you expect? What went as expected? What surprised you?
It's a good question. I mean, it was actually fairly gradual because they made it available. They rolled it out internationally a year before,
Yeah.
and I actually have a fair number of international students, sometimes more international students than ones in the U.S., partly because of one company that I work for, but also a YouTube channel was getting a lot of students from international students. And I'm not exactly sure why that was, but that would be, there was a little while there while I was doing both. And then there was, last year's juniors in the United States kind of had their year split up into two, where some of them were trying to get it done by December, which was the last time they could take the old version. And if they didn't, they'd have to switch over. And that seemed to be pretty difficult for a lot of them. And I'm not, I think some of them were able to do it, but I think the ones that I had who did better kind of, they kind of carried it into over the summer and into their senior year. I don't know if it just took longer to kind of get used to it, but like the students that I had who tried to take the one in March last year, I don't know. It seems like that was a really tough one for them because they'd been preparing for one test and the format switched over, and it was a difficult transition for them. I didn't have a whole lot of students who did try to make that transition, and I think a couple of them, I don't know. It seemed like they were so frustrated by it that they just stuck with their previous scores. It seems like, yeah.
Got it, William. And how was the transition as a tutor for you?
It's been okay. It's been okay. I mean, I think probably the biggest challenge is again kind of the figuring out what to do for practice materials once it's a little better now, given that they did release some newer tests, some tests, and then some additional question bank questions. But I always try to use official questions when possible, and there just aren't a ton of them available. I mean, there are some. I mean, I think I originally had put together, not for any commercial use, but just for my students, questions that I had adapted from the previous version, and it would reformat them into digital SAT style questions. But that only worked with certain question types, like the standard English conventions and transition words, and even with those, I came to realize that while they were decent, and some of them were really close to digital SAT questions, even those, some of them have been phased out, or some of the tendencies with those questions are different, and so I had different students come to me with their own questions from third-party companies that really varied in quality from pretty decent to not very good at all, and it's difficult for anybody trying to come up with questions based off of, and I think again the attention to detail isn't always so great. I would sometimes look at them and just, for example, like the vocabulary level, it would be off base. It would be too obscure based on what seems to be on the test, or just the pattern in the answer choices is difficult, or is not difficult. It doesn't quite match what you see on the test, and so I mean that's probably been the biggest challenge. And whereas at least with the ACT, there's no shortage of materials available, and I don't know. I did see that they're shortening the sections and making the science optional, but I don't know exactly if there are going to be any other changes. It's also happened with the GRE and the GMAT, where they shortened their tests and made some changes, but they haven't really, with those tests. It's nice in that they've either gotten rid of a question type or shortened it, but they haven't changed the format, and so old materials are still usable, and so that's something. So I think that's been a challenge, but I've just kind of adapt out, and Khan Academy, question bank, and some third-party questions. I guess there's enough, but you have to be resourceful.
Got it, William. And have you had to bring about a lot of changes in your teaching processes, methodologies?
Some. I mean, I think in one sense, certain things it is simplified for, like the grammar and punctuation. It seems like there's a smaller range of topics. But on the other hand, I think the most challenging question types for most of the students fall under the information and ideas heading. The SAT, that would be what I would call logically completing the text, inferences, and command of evidence, strength and weaken, and those questions. And it does seem like, even though those questions on the available practice tests can vary in their difficulty, it seems like they're getting more difficult as the tests go on. And certain students, some students, it's a real struggle. It's with the time management and really the approach to the questions. And I've even recently been trying to think of some new things to do with those, because I think with the students, and it's something I've never done before, which is and I actually need to iron this out a little bit more, but to actually give them questions about passages that aren't the actual test question. Because I think sometimes students are so concerned with trying to get the answer, and they want to see if they got the right answer or not, that they don't follow the process all the way through. But then on top of that, they're so concerned with taking time that they're not reading it systematically, and they don't know what to read it for. They feel like they have to read it again, but a lot of times that isn't going to help if you don't know what to read for. And I try to emphasize, one of the things that I'll do generally now when I start with them is, if looking at those questions, I'll start with the quantitative questions, the graph or table questions, because in those questions you can see here are the variables, either in these columns or rows or this axis or that axis. But what I try to emphasize is that you also have variables that are in the passages when you don't have graphs or tables, and you want to read to identify those. And a lot of times there's going to be a relationship between them that you can sketch out and using up and down arrows, or I think that's the simplest way to keep track of relationships between variables. And I find that this is another thing that I've especially doing a lot of online tutoring, it's hard to know exactly how much they're doing it, but there's a certain reluctance sometimes to annotate, which is interesting kind of, because I don't think anybody would be reluctant to write something down in the math section. Like the student wouldn't try to do something, keep it in their head. And I think that there is some sense that, it's going to take more time. That's the biggest objection, and to writing it down. But I think that's not actually true. I think it saves time. I think it helps you to understand what you're reading, and it's not like I'm recommending or asking anybody to write down whole sentences. And I always tell them, you don't have to be able. This isn't for somebody else to be able to understand, or even for you yourself to be able to understand next month or even next week. It's just in the moment to get it down. And so the up and down arrows thing is certainly nothing. It's nothing fancy, but that's actually something that I got from watching a GMAT tutor. There might be a noise here. I hope in the background. Okay. I hope there's a noise filter, but.
It adds to the ambience.
Okay. But it was a GMAT tutor, because I only started doing the GMAT about a few years ago, and I don't have as many GMAT students, but I was getting up to speed on some of those question types. And there's a instructor on YouTube who has some videos and seminars on YouTube, and I was like, that's a good way to keep track of it. It's up and down arrows, and so I think those questions they're definitely always going to be a challenge for any student, but the combination of the time management and the higher level of thinking or reasoning, that's become the hardest part, as opposed to on the old test it was just the long passages, the paired passages, the history passages, when it would be something written in the 17 or 1800s. Those kind of things would be sort of reliably the things that students disliked the most and found the most difficult. Now it's those complex reasoning passages. Yeah.
Got it, William. And who's the YouTube GMAT person? Because I just had a couple of them who are on YouTube. I was just curious if it's one of them.
his name is Marty something, Marty Murray or something. He's
Okay.
older. They advertised that, or that he had an 800, which now they switched the scoring format. Now that would be an 805.
Right.
But and it was specifically on the critical reasoning questions. Yeah, which
Got
are
it. It's not him. It's not him.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not him who I thought.
okay. Okay.
I mean, not a lot of people that I talk to teach multiple test preps, William. So, but those who do, I mean, do you sometimes get ideas that you transfer from one test to another test in terms of, approach?
Yes, yeah, and I think that's definitely. I mean, the order that I went in was SAT, ACT. Although I never did the ACT as a student, and when I did the SAT, it was so long ago that I might as well not have done it. And then as going into the GRE or going into graduate school, I took the GRE, and that was a few formats ago on that test. And that was the first test that I really prepared a lot for, test prep wise. And then out on the other end of graduate school, SAT, ACT, GRE, and then a few years later, GMAT. But there's a lot of similarity between, say, from the GRE to the GMAT. The reading comprehension is very similar. What the GMAT calls critical reasoning is very similar to a certain kind of question on the GRE, and then those in turn connect back to the SAT. And then another thing is that there's a distinction between what I would call or some of the tests call it, but explicit details and inferences, which all the reading comprehension tests use that same vocabulary, where if it says according to or the passage indicates, that means it's a detail that you should be able to find a close paraphrase for in the answer choices, relative to the passage. Whereas if it says suggests or implies or most likely or can be inferred, that means it's an inference. And so that distinction between explicit details and inferences is something that I haven't looked into the LSAT or not much, so I don't know if it holds there. But on all four of those other tests, I mean, the SAT, ACT, GRE, GMAT, it applies, and even the same words that signal what you're dealing with on those questions. And then also you get questions about function or purpose, purpose of the whole passage, function of a sentence, main idea. So that's similar too. And then, I mean, the GRE has text completion, where they do bring in multiple blanks, but that's the same basic idea as the words in context on the SAT. And so, the GMAT used to have sentence correction, which they got rid of, but I would occasionally use some of those as challenging questions for SAT or ACT students because
right.
But so there's a certain amount, and there's always something. There's each test will have something that the other tests don't have, whether it's on the GMAT with the data sufficiency or the GRE with quantitative comparison. So they all have something a little bit different, but it's not like, and I do try to stay mindful of the differences, so I don't try to shoehorn strategies from one test to another. I don't think I used that word correctly, but I don't try to shoehorn strategies from one test into another one. But there are occasional times when I'll find questions from, let's say it's a more advanced SAT student who's trying to get from the high 1400s into the 1500s. And we've used all the questions that are available. There's been a couple of times when I've used some of the GMAT critical reasoning questions as additional examples. Again, that's one of those things where if there were more College Board examples, I'd use those. But yeah, so I mean, they're and I imagine that the test makers are somewhat aware of the other tests, and I don't know if the test makers, if people, I imagine at some point it's happened that somebody worked for one test and then worked for another. But it did seem to me like, just like when the SAT brought out the previous format, the way they did the writing and language section, it was clearly modeled on the ACT. or I mean, it was very similar to what the ACT did in terms of passages. I shouldn't. I mean, it seems like that would have been like maybe where they looked for examples.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's an interesting point. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
ACT now, I think it's modeling a lot on what
On the SAT, yeah. So they kind of
SATs, so
go back and forth. But I also think, I mean, with these, I mean, the SAT did used to have what they call command of evidence questions on the previous version of the test, but it was very different, where you answer one question, and then after it, you'd have to point to the lines that supported that, and that was a whole. Boy, I hadn't even thought about that for a while. That was a whole challenge, those questions and the strategy and the order in which you try to read things. What they call command of evidence now is quite similar to those GRE and GMAT reasoning questions. And so it could have been that they looked to those tests and found some. So yeah, there's definitely similarity, and so it helps. I mean, I think trying to do too many tests is not great, just because it's just a lot of, I don't know. It's
you
a
mean
tutor.
as a tutor?
Yeah, it's a, I mean, I wouldn't recommend anybody trying to do too many if you're just starting out. Maybe take some time to get used to one, and where where the materials are and you've done the practice tests, so that. But then once you've done it, adding a new one or learning a new test is not. It should be quicker each time, within the ones I've mentioned. And again, I would imagine, I don't know when or if it would happen, but if I were to try to do the LSAT, I would at least have the GMAT and GRE to draw on. And I know there's other question types that aren't on those, but it's sort of a bootstrapping sort of thing.
Got it, William.
Yeah.
And William, what are your views on, a couple of changes in SAT? One is the reading passages becoming shorter. And
Yeah. I mean,
I'll go on to the next one after this.
Yeah, it's a tough call, because I think in one sense it's sort of the way of the world. I mean, I don't know what it would be like for, on the one hand, a high school English teacher to try to get the students to read books in full, and or to be a student in high school and do that, given all the, I didn't have all those distractions to deal with when I was a student, and screens and things like that. And it was not always easy to finish the books that we were supposed to read. I mean, I did always try, and I often, I remember ninth grade English, where we had to read Great Expectations, and our English teacher decided that there were 3 sections, and she would give each of us, each section, a test on a different section of the book. And so one class got a test on the first section, another class got a test on the second section, and our class got a test on the third section. I was like, well, that's tough, because that book was I don't think many people made it to the end. More people got through the first third of the book. So I felt like we got the unlucky draw, because it was how many? And I think there were not many of us who even tried to get through that section, and so the grades in our class weren't very good. But that was pre-internet, that was pre cell phone and all that, and so I can't imagine it's only gotten more difficult. So and then on top of that, just in the last year, the ability for somebody to give a book to an AI program and ask it to summarize it. And so, I do think it's, at some level, it's still important. I still read books, and I've read this last week a couple of books on paper. And sometimes it's hard for me to set aside the phone, but I'll do it. And so I still think it's an important thing for people to be able to do. And it's just not being tested anymore. And, on the other hand, it's still not easy. I thought it would be too easy for when they just shifted to the paragraphs, and that hasn't been the case. There's a lot less of the detail questions, because the detail questions, they're something like 45% of the ACT reading. The SAT, they used to be more like maybe, 20%. Now it's like there might be, one or two detail questions out of the whole 54. There's more on the inferences. So, I mean, the reading that they're asked, because it's not that hard to find a detail in a single paragraph as opposed to a whole passage. I think it's anybody who thinks that it's necessary. It's certainly not easier to get a really good score on the digital compared to the previous version. It seems like it might even be harder to get into the 1500s than it used to be, because there's so little margin for error in doing it. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that I'm glad I don't have to make those decisions about about that, and I'm also glad I'm not dealing with. I mean, I taught a little bit. I taught high school way back before grad school, and then I taught a little bit in graduate school. And when I taught, it was, I had not, or maybe I had just gotten a smartphone myself, but I was not really. I was a late adopter of that. I had a flip phone for a while, and so, but all my students had, and I could just see them kind of being hypnotized, and I had to figure out, okay, what am I going to do about this? And these are college students. And so, again, that seems like that's a real challenge, and also just, I don't know, Twitter isn't as big now, and now they call it X, but I mean, just moving to short text, moving to things like that is, it's a challenge. And again, I don't know whether it's better or not, but I think the dense short passages are still quite challenging for a lot of students. Yeah.
Got it, William. And another change is the Desmos calculator. My question is, do you have to set aside dedicated time just for students to be able to pick it up? How to use the Desmos?
That's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of students have seen it already. I mean, it's actually, but I will walk through stuff with them. And there's certain quirks about it that I don't quite understand, but I know that that they happen. Like there's the slider that will come up like for the value of a constant, but there are certain situations in which it won't come up. And I've learned that if one way doesn't work, you do it another way and it'll come up. And but I mean, it has definitely changed the nature. I mean, when I was doing the previous version of it, I really didn't use the calculator a lot, because part of it was I didn't have, maybe I shouldn't admit this, but I had like a Casio graphing calculator that was not the same model that the students had. I mean, it was cheaper, it did the same stuff, and even if I did have a TI-84 or whatever, not all the students would, and so we would have to coordinate, and I would say, that they're not giving you a test of how well you can use the calculator. But I mean, now, whether or not they're doing that, there are just a lot of questions that having the calculator completely changes things, and having it throughout the whole test. To give one example, the problems involving the number of solutions in a quadratic that they would often give on the no calculator section, and you would have to know how to use the discriminant, b squared minus 4ac, to get those right. And now I still walk through it with students and say, you still need to know how to do this by hand, because they can give you a problem where it's hard to use the calculator because maybe it's a free response and you've got to zero in on a decimal value that's going to be really difficult. And so I also, after doing that, I'll say, but here's how we could do it in the calculator, and I'll compare side by side. I don't know if they get annoyed with me for doing that, but I try to emphasize that, it's not about getting the right answer to this one question right now. It's about being prepared for what they're going to ask you on the test. And but there's definitely, I mean, and there are certain problems where, it's a certain kind of ingenuity that's required. I mean, I'll just say like there are certain test taking strategies that work on math problems, not just on the SAT, but any type of test, where this is another thing that overlaps with the GMAT, the GRE, and the ACT, where you've got a variable in the question, and then the answer choices all, they might be, 3x plus 2, or 4x minus 7. I mean, there's different things where there's a variable in the question, and there's certain strategies that you can apply.
Right.
Or or if they say that there's a constant in the problem and that doesn't appear in the answer, you can usually just assign a value to that constant, find the output, and then find the answer choice that matches up with that, and then combining that with the use of the calculator. There's certain problems where like you can arrive at a solution using that method without needing to do the skill that is ostensibly being tested. And I mean that was true before with questions involving long division, polynomial division. You would never actually have to do polynomial division because of and I think and I used to have mixed feelings about that because I did do a fair amount of math tutoring and even taught a little math as a high school teacher, but it's just had to accept that it's a different thing, and that in some sense, and I think it's even more true of the GRE and the GMAT, where they're taking, those tests are sticking with more basic concepts than you even get on the SAT, but asking them in more challenging ways. So really, they're not testing that math knowledge; they're testing problem-solving ability. And so, in a sense, I just kind of think of it that way. But I mean, the biggest help is that it makes it's uniform, where everybody has the same calculator, at least potentially. And so I find that I use it a lot more, whereas I would almost never use a calculator in answer explanations before the switch over. Yeah.
Got it, William.
Yeah.
William, moving on to the teaching aspect of things as a tutor, is it just the subject matter that you focus on, or are there other aspects? Working on the mindset, how do students think? There are a lot of other things students come with.
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, there was one company that I taught for that we had the slides that were made by the company, and there were some of these things that we were that were part of the lesson plan for the first couple of lessons. And it would be a little uncomfortable sometimes to try to walk through them because they felt a little bit kind of like motivational speaker points. And I don't naturally do that kind of thing, like slogans, but I will. That's so I don't come in with packaged points, but there are things, and a lot of times it will be. I don't know. Sometimes it's more with the GRE and GMAT students because there's such a difference in where they're coming from, and a lot of times even what target score they're getting. Because let's say the GRE, you might have. I mean, I've had GRE students who were trying to get into law school because they accept that for law school. But I've also had others who were trying to get into it's like a nursing program or a different kind of thing, and so they have different target scores. But there's also been some of them have not opened a math book in 10 years. A lot of times they're coming from a more non-traditional place, and so a lot of them have concerns about how long it's going to take them to do the questions. And so there are different things that I'll talk to. I mean, another thing that I picked up from the aforementioned GMAT instructor, whose name I can't remember, Marty Murray, maybe, something like that. But he emphasized, and I will mention this to a lot of students, which is that when you're first getting used to a question type, specifically like those harder reading passages, don't worry about the time, because if you're trying to learn how to do it properly, that's the first thing to do, and then the time will come with that. And I think you reflect on that a little bit, and it's kind of similar to a lot of other things. Like, I guess if you're learning a musical instrument, you wouldn't practice a scale at 200 beats a minute before you could play it at 60 beats a minute, and it's that sort of thing. And so, that's one thing. I mean, another thing is I've had, let's say I've had some students who will will say, I'm going to do 3 hours. Like they'll have trouble doing the work, and let's say it's during the summer, they'll say, I'm going to do 3 hours tomorrow. And I say, well, that's great if you can, but rather than setting yourself up for 3 hours, or like telling yourself that you're going to do 3 hours, and then anything short of that is it's a failure, and also it's going to be really hard to get started on that. If you're saying I got to do 3 hours, where do I even start? If you just say I'm going to do 15 minutes, and then if it's going well, keep going. And that's a little bit of something that I, in writing my dissertation and trying to get started and get going and unstuck on that. So I mean, I think I really try to adapt it to what it seems like the student is, needing help with. And there are some students who, I had one last summer who came to me through my YouTube channel, and he would, every time we met, he would email a PDF that had all of his wrong answers from all the different stuff that he had done. And most of the time it wasn't stuff that I would assign him. It was stuff that he would find and do it, and he would send me those, and we'd go over them. And so if every student were like that, it would be, it's to the point where it's kind of like, do you really even need me? But I mean, I would be able to help him. But it's like, if every student were like that, there wouldn't be a whole lot to do. On the other hand, so it really varies in terms of where they need help and how much of it is the content versus the organization. But I've never been good at, or it's never something that I've done, is to say, you need to make a notebook with these sections. Maybe I should do that. But I think back to how I felt as a student. I don't know. I wouldn't always. I could get things done and not necessarily do it in the way that they recommended it. And so, maybe that's, it's been a long time since I was in a high school classroom, in terms of, teaching. And so, maybe I, I don't want to say give them more credit. I don't know. I try to, a lot of my students are not all, but a lot of them are ones who already have a pretty good score and are really trying to get to that high level.
Right.
I don't tend to have that many these days who are really, and not to say that they don't need help or that there isn't a place for tutors to work with it, but like students who are down at 1,000 or 1,100 and really like don't want to do it. I don't really like being that person who shows up. And I've had a few times, especially pre-2020, I was still doing a fair amount of in-person tutoring, and occasionally do it now. But even my local students tend to prefer Zoom, and it's great not having to schlep around in traffic and all that stuff.
Right.
But where was I going with this? But I had a couple of students where it was clear that their parents wanted them to do it and they didn't, and I would not be the one to find the motivation for them to do it. I would often kind of feel like honestly, the way I would say, it's like, if they don't want to do it, and or it doesn't seem like it's where their aptitude is, maybe that's a sign that they should do something else, at least for the time being. So I don't know. I tend to be sort of it is one thing I like about tutoring as opposed to teaching, is like my least favorite thing about the teaching would be that there were students who just did not want to be there.
Yeah.
And it's hard enough teaching and doing a good job teaching when everybody is there, and
you don't have to
be there.
motivate them as well. It's better if they're driven. I'll probably conclude with this question or this topic, William. You said you started with SAT and then you moved to ACT. Do you find yourself in a lot of situations where the parents or the students are reluctant to take ACT even though you might feel ACT would be a good fit for the students, they want to stick to SAT?
I haven't found that so much. I mean, I think
Or are you
lately, yeah.
a SAT inclined tutor?
Well, yeah, it really varied. It's really switched again in the last few years. I mean, two things that have been factors. One is, I was for about 5 years. I was teaching for a company, and they would assign the classes, and I would have at that point preferred to do a little more SAT. I was getting the ACT classes, and it was a little harder to teach in a sense because it's not as tricky. So there's not as much that you can offer them sometimes. I mean, apart from the content. But on top of that, since I've not been teaching with that company, I've taught with another company, and their enrollment was strongly geared toward SAT. They would have some ACT, but it might be 4-to-1 ratio in terms of the assignments.
Right.
And then when I started making videos for my YouTube channel about 3 years ago, I did plan on doing a mix of both, but at least initially that there was, it got a better response, the SAT, and I think there was a better response, and I think partly, and this was not something that I anticipated. I thought there was going to be more interest from American students in the math, and it was international students in the verbal, international students in reading and writing, and so it kind of, as those got a better response, then I would do more, and then people who would contact me through that route were looking for SAT, and so it's really gone in that direction without really, planning it, or and so maybe. I have had some, like just recently, a student who was curious about the ACT, and I said, well, you've done a lot for the SAT, and you're pretty close. But if they're giving the school day ACT next month, and I said, well, you can pause the SAT, take the ACT, see how you're, or I guess she already took it. Wait till you see how it comes back, and if it seems like something where it does seem like a better fit, then you can switch over to it or put a little more emphasis on it. But I think it's a tough sell just because a 3 to 4 hour test versus a 2 hour test.
Yep.
But there would be certain criteria. A lot of times it's just a feel thing from when they work on the practice tests. But it would be kind of like the science section would be a decider in some cases, or in other cases, either they felt like they could do well or they just wanted no part of it. That would be a factor. Or the reading. Sometimes it's a pretty different style of reading, or at least on the older test. The ACT is a lot more detail oriented. So I haven't had any issue with anybody in particular saying that they didn't want to do the ACT. It's really been more a matter, yeah. But again, it'll be interesting to see if this shifts things back.
Yeah.
Because, and I can't remember the chronology with the GMAT and the GRE, because, they're not totally competitors, but business schools take the GRE, and so they're, in a sense, there's some overlap, and I can't remember, but it was in pretty quick succession that one announced that they were shortening it, and then the other did, and maybe they were already planning it, but they do have those considerations. It's not like they make the test cheaper, I don't think, when they make it shorter, but it's a way to kind of maintain a market share. And it does seem like, I don't have any specific numbers on it, but it would be a tough sell to, I think, in general, to take that much longer test compared to the shorter one, even if the longer test was a slightly better fit.
Yeah, I guess we'll wait and see how enhanced ACT turns up. William, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me.